Well, greetings and welcome back to our study on becoming God's people. This week, we finally get to what everybody has been waiting for, the book of Leviticus. I'm sure that if you are like most people, that little tongue-in-cheek reference either made you kind of get a little angry or laugh. I'm hoping laugh. But Leviticus, I think, is one of the most misunderstood books in the Bible. I think that it has this reputation of being nothing but a lot of rules and regulations prescribing how Israel was supposed to live their day-to-day lives. In fact, we have this idea of legalism based on the idea of Leviticus, and that churches and religion in general is very legalistic and prescriptive because of the book of Leviticus providing us with so many what we see as laws for how to structure one's day and one's life. But Leviticus is not about giving us hard and fast rules. Rather, Leviticus is about helping us to apply the Ten Commandments to our lives. In other words, even from its very inception, Leviticus was not meant to be read simply as this hard and fast law code that you were supposed to read through, memorize, and then stick to in a very precise way. Rather, it was more like a book of guidelines where you are given a certain framework for life, but then you go in and you say, well, how does this particular instruction apply to the current situation? Kind of like how, if we want to get somewhat technical in the law, how precedent works. It gives you a guideline and you say, does this guideline apply to this particular case? And if so, how does this guideline apply to this particular case? And with legal precedents, as we are constantly aware of, they're ever changing because courts and judges decide, well, what this previous court decided, what this previous judge decided, doesn't really apply. It doesn't really make sense to think like that. We need a different standard for how we judge cases, and so the court will write a new standard. That's a little more of what Leviticus is. In other words, it is not meant to be day-to-day prescription. Not that we shouldn't apply it, not that we shouldn't use it and think about it and allow it to influence our lives, but it is not a hard and fast rule book for us. It is rather something that guides our framework and how we walk in our days as a precedent setter, not a hard and fast law book. So with that in mind, we open up and we instantly see sacrifices. Well, the idea is that Israelites were going to sacrifice. They already had this in their cultural background to sacrifice. So what these precedents were about is, what does a proper sacrifice look like? It does not mean that every person who ever wants to worship God has to sacrifice. It is about, if you are going to sacrifice, what does it mean? And what does it mean to properly worship God? So when we look at this, we don't just dismiss the laws or the regulations because we no longer sacrifice. We look at the precedent laid down in the sacrificial system, and we say, how does that maybe apply to what I do today? How can I take that, the instructions given to the people, and say, well, this applies to me? And we can easily. One of the easiest things to look at is that when we look at, say, the olam, which is in the passage for the week, which the burnt sacrifice, the entirely burnt offering, we look at that and we see that there are three different regulations set up for the olam. The one is for what we would probably say is a cow, something, a domesticated animal. It says a behemoth, which is a domesticated animal, but a large animal, and more than likely something along the lines of a cow. The second animal is something from the flocks, so a sheep or a goat, something of slightly smaller value. And then the last one is a bird. And right away we can say, well, when we create a system to help us connect to God, which is what this sacrificial system is about, right away we can say, well, it must include everyone. Nobody can be left out because of their income level or their status. Right away, we just have to say, whatever our means of worshiping God, it has to include everyone. And that's a direct that's direct reflection from Leviticus, where the Israelites, again, they were going to sacrifice. Sacrifice was their structure of worship. That's how everybody around them worshiped. But they took that cultural setting and they gave specific guidelines to help structure that cultural worship toward the right end. Another thing that we can see is that the worship must be kind of pure, in the sense that you are approaching God and you have to do so with respect and reverence. The idea being that you have to provide a pure sacrifice, a blameless, blemishless sacrifice. In other words, you can't just bring something that's hobbled, something that's useless or worthless. This sacrifice has to mean something to you if you're going to bring it to God. That's something that we can transform or transpose into our current setting. Our sacrifice, our time, our gifts, everything that we do in worship has to be something that is meaningful to us. It costs us something. There is a cost associated with it. And the idea of it being pure, you'll notice that the worshiper lays a hand on the head of the animal. Well, that's about transferring that purity to the worshiper and saying, God, I'm offering something pure in a way that I hope will represent me, and its purity will represent me, so I can be pure in your presence. And then again, we want to offer worship that is pure. Now, in the Christian tradition, this is where the idea of Jesus being the sacrifice comes in. Jesus being the sacrifice is a metaphor that Jesus's purity covers us in the way that the purity of the animal sacrifice covered for the Israelites. And lastly is we notice that the priest does not really do a lot in the sacrificial system. The priest lays the animal carcass on the altar, sprinkles the blood on the altar, and lights the fire on the altar. In other words, the priest cares for the altar, but the worshiper does everything else. The worshiper is the one to slaughter the animal, to skin the animal, to butcher the animal, to cleanse the animal, to wash it, and do all of the ritualistic work. In other words, even in the ancient Israelite tradition, the worshiper was doing everything for himself or herself. The worshiper was the one who was doing the work of connecting to God, because it was on their behalf that they were connecting to God. The priest, unlike so many other religious traditions, which I think have influenced the way Christians read this text, in Greek and Roman and ancient Near Eastern worshiping traditions, the priest did the work of the sacrifice. And so we tend to just import that onto this text and think that the Israelite priest did everything for the worshiper. No, the worshiper was very much involved in the sacrifice. It was by their hand that the animal died. It was by their hand that the animal was cleaned and made ready. It was by their hand that everything was set in place for the sacrifice. And this became a very important part of worship, that it was individual. We should also mention just real quick that this was done in silence. There was no magic spell. The worshiper just came with the purity of the animal, trusting in God's character. No magic, no spell, no liturgical prayers. There might have been liturgical prayers, but they weren't passed down. All of this, as far as we know, was done in silence. And that is important because it says to us that the gift of the offering was between God and the worshiper, and the worshiper just trusted in God's character to accept the sacrifice and meet the worshiper in worship. It was not something the worshiper did. There was no particular prayer or incantation that they could do to guarantee the sacrifice. No, it was just all on God's mercy and grace. And that is where passages like Exodus 36 that tell us how merciful and gracious God is become vital to us, because we are trusting on God to accept our worship, but we know that God is merciful and gracious and does accept our worship because of God's own character, not because of the worship that we provide. So I hope that meant something to you. I hope you learned a little bit about the character of worship in Leviticus. This should be a fun several weeks as we piece our way through the book of Leviticus. I hope you're enjoying the journey. As always, if you have questions or comments, please leave them for me. Let me know. I would love to deal with those. So until we meet again, God bless.